Curtis, it's great to have you here. And I thought we'd dive straight in with asking you a question. And that question is, what is the most common form of cyber attack today?
Well, based on what I'm seeing, for example, there's a Verizon report that comes out every year, and they pretty much talked about ransomware. That's all anyone seems to be talking to me about lately. Yeah. Ransomware is kind of it's the end result rather than the attack itself. Ransomware isn't necessarily the attack vector, as we say. It's really sort of the symptom that happens after the initial attack, which may be, we can talk about different ways like phishing and things like that.
Yeah, I'd appreciate actually. Yeah, what are some of the more common methods of entry? Let's say the actual attack part.
So I'd say the most common method of gaining entry into an environment is via stolen credentials in some way, right? They basically steal your username and password, and then they're you, right? And that is typically done via some type of phishing attack, phishing with a PH, for those that don't know that. And this is where, they basically they send you an email, they maybe make a phone call, and they pretend to be someone else, right? And they lure you in. They get you, they send you. I got a text today that said that my card has been declined at a retailer. Literally that level of vagueness, right? My card has been declined at a retailer. Which card might it be, right? And they get you to trust them and to give up information that they could use. And the biggest one of which, if we're looking at a direct cyber attack to a company, would be your username and password. They may also get that via your username and password has been stolen via some other way, and then it's being advertised on the dark web as one of thousands that are being sold on some list. And so I would say that my biggest advice for people on the front end of things, one is to have good user basically credential management, which today means username and password. Hopefully at some point in the relatively near future we will do away with usernames and passwords, but for today that's what we have. And so I talk a lot about I'm a big believer in password management systems, and which allow you to have a separate username and password. That way, if someone guesses your Netflix password, it's not also going to be the same username and password that you use to administer your backup server. Right?
No, absolutely. With our community, we talk a lot and encourage strongly the use of password manager apps, such as, and we tend to talk about 1Password or Bitwarden are the two we tend to recommend.
Right.
For sure, that's a very common, that's a prevailing theme in everything we talk about and educate around.
Yeah, and then of course MFA, right? MFA is not perfect, multi-factor authentication. It's not perfect. In fact, it's an attack vector. That some basically they call it MFA exhaustion. So they send you the bad actor, if they get your access, they send you multiple MFA authentication requests, hoping that you just get tired of it and go fine. Even by the way, I don't understand that particular method. If I'm getting 25 MFA requests and I'm not trying to log into anything, I'm going to be like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, red flag. Red flag.
My response is not going to be, yeah, sure, go ahead. But anyway, so MFA is not perfect, but it is, it's better than nothing, right?
Yeah, absolutely, of course. So certainly we certainly recommend to anyone to use MFA or two-factor authentication, sometimes it's called. Wherever it's available, use it. And if there's a choice of how it's going to verify, Our understanding is that SMS is the least secure of the options.
I don't know. It might be in competition with email. Email is also used as a factor, but I think SMS is definitely a very bad. Again, still better than nothing, but
for sure,
not what you should be using. You should be using some type of app. I mean, Microsoft have an authentication app. There's a Google, and I tend to personally use Google. But for sure, if it's available, use it is the advice, and use for sure have long, complex, unique passwords and make that possible by using a password manager app. Right, exactly. And I'm currently up to 25 characters, I think is what I'm using for my password length. And it's because there's a table somewhere that shows you how long it will take current computers to guess your password. Yep. And I started to get uncomfortable with my old length, which was like 16. I was starting to get uncomfortable with the relatively short period of time that they could do that. And so I just put it up to 25, which is like, I don't know, it said like 50 billion years or something.
Which shouldn't be a problem in our lifetime. Although, computing power gets faster and more effective, and
that's the problem.
Cracking software gets better and better. So, staying ahead of the curve, which is obviously the game that you're in and the game we're in, and helping our clients to be in. So these are all ways that attacks can be launched, for sure. And I mean, the ultimate aim is, in the case of ransomware attacks, is trying to get what? They gain access and do what? How do they then deliver this payload?
They need that initial infection, right? So they need to gain full access to some computer within your environment, right? So that could be someone's laptop. I don't think they're yet using, I know they are attacking mobile phones, but they're not using them as an attack in the data center yet. But so they infect your laptop, or maybe they do infect a server directly somehow. And then from there, and this is the thing, the one thing I think is important for people to understand. They don't then immediately start encrypting that server, right? They have gained access to the environment. They now have, essentially a back door into your computing environment. So what they're going to start, the first thing that they're going to do, that the software is going to do, is going to reach out to what's called a command and control server. And it does this often. A very common way is to use DNS. And by the way, this was news to me not that long ago. I didn't understand how someone would use DNS as a way to have a two-way conversation. And basically, the software reaches out to a very unique, very weird-looking to you and me host name, and it's a subdomain of a subdomain of a subdomain of a subdomain.
Yeah, right.
And then the request comes back with a particular string, maybe an IP address, and then that IP address is then interpreted by the software to say, oh, well, this is what I need to do. And most likely, if it's the first infection, what it's going to be told to do is to sort of probe around, see where else it can go, see what else it can infect. And so once you're in an environment, there are unfortunately a number of very vulnerable applications and ports. A very good example of that is called the Remote Desktop Protocol, which is, or RDP for short. So this is a system that pretty much every, both Windows and Unix and Linux have, and it allows you to assume control of the desktop remotely, right? And many system administration things are very UI driven, and so you need to be running a piece of software locally on the desktop, and so this allows you to do that remotely. The problem is RDP is incredibly insecure and incredibly easy to hack if you have direct access to it. And that's why some, and I love this, some refer to RDP as ransomware deployment protocol, because it's just a way to infect another system, right? So they might use NFS, right, the network file share, or SMB, the server message block, which are just file sharing protocols within Windows and Unix. And they will also, and this is where my area of expertise really comes in, they might also begin directly attempting to identify and attack your backup infrastructure, for a lot of reasons.
Which is a really key topic, huh? So when we'll come to that, I mean, so a ransomware attack, let's say they've gained access, they have control, they've sat back, they've watched what's going on, they've taken their time, they've been able to install further malware that will go off and try and contaminate you, take control of basically more. And I'm assuming, and I know, but would love to hear your take on the prevalence of, I mean, the cybercriminals, they're not stupid, and so their malware will look for backups as well, correct?
Right. It will definitely look for backups. And at some point, right, so, that initial infection happens. At some point, the malware will have gone as far as it can go, infected as many servers as it can infect. And again, mind you, this is just sort of a stealth infection, right? Nobody knows this is happening. Meanwhile, you've got this piece of software crawling around in your infrastructure, taking control of servers, or just, basically getting onto servers somehow. And then, and one of which being the backup server, right? Then at some point it deploys itself, right? It actually activates and says, okay, now it's time to go for something. And it's going to do one of two things. If it's an old school ransomware product, it will simply try to encrypt, as much as it can. If it's managed to infect a VMware infrastructure, for example, it might actually start encrypting the VMDKs, the files on the server that actually, each VMware VM, virtual machine, is really represented by one or more files on the VMware server, right? The same with Hyper-V, the same with pretty much any virtualization product. If they want to cripple you, if they can infect the VMware server, they can encrypt your entire VMware infrastructure like that, because they're just a bunch of files, right? They do that. So that's one thing they're going to try to do. And then the other thing that they're going to try to do is steal information, right? Exfiltrate is the fancy word for that. Basically, they want to access your important databases, your important file shares, your, if you live in a country that's subject to really good privacy laws, hopefully you don't have things like spreadsheets with important, personal information in them that can be just grabbed off of a file share, but they're going to look for that. I know, like, for example, with GDPR, that is considered a very bad thing to do, right? And I know Australia has done a lot in the privacy law. We're pretty much really behind in that, as we often are in many things. But but that's the other thing they're going to try to do, is to steal information.
And they want to steal that information because they can.
That's a really good point, which I failed to make. They're going to basically blackmail you with that information. So in the end, they're going to, and you might get what's actually referred to as a double extortion attack, meaning they say, give us, to steal Austin Powers $1 million, right?
That's right.
Give us $1 million, and we'll give you your environment back. Or they can say, give us $1 million, or we're going to dump your customer database out into the wild, right? Or we're going to reveal this product that you've been working on, under wraps for a year, that nobody knows about. We're going to reveal it.
So really, IP.
Yeah, IP. Or, here in, I live in Southern California. there was some very embarrassing communications that came out from a Los Angeles City Council meeting. And some people lost their careers as a result. And they should have, by the way, based on the stuff that they were doing and saying. But that could also be, it could be just be embarrassing stuff, right? We're going to, the most famous one there was actually Sony Pictures back in 2014. The hack, which was believed at the time to be something from Korea, they revealed all these emails of how the Sony Pictures management spoke about their talent, right?
Right.
And damaging them as a reputation. So basically, it's just blackmail. It's extortion by saying, we're going to reveal this data, and which will damage your company. So that's the newer way that people are attacking companies.
And so the victim in this case, that's the primary victim,
right,
who's being held to ransom. They have, in basic terms, two options, I guess. One, they can pay the ransom and hope they get their data back. Or two, they can restore their systems from a backup, we hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I'll just, not to be too much gloom and doom, but if data has been stolen, I don't know what choice you have, right? If you've managed, this is why even though I specialize in backup and recovery, and that's really my thing, I try to tell people that you should be looking. There are ways to watch for, stop, looking for data exfiltration going on in your environment, right? Because if that happens, those two choices really come down to, well, the two choices are pay the ransom and maybe they don't publish the data, or don't pay the ransom and they're going to publish the data and damage your company, right? But yeah, so that is sort of separate, but I always want to bring this up, right? But yeah, the backup system, the DR system, is crucial in this. And unfortunately, the bad actors have figured this out as well. And so what they've started doing is they've started directly attacking the backup server as part of the attacks that we talked about earlier, right? These are smart folks, and they're like, if we can find out what kind of backup software they're running, and by the way, it's not that hard to figure it out if you know what you're doing. Right. Give me a login to one of your servers. I'll figure out what backup software you're running. It's not that hard. And then I'll figure out which one is the backup server. Again, not that hard. And then I just do a direct attack against it. And God forbid you've got RDP turned on, right? Or maybe I know specific exploits that are specific to that particular backup software package. Just within the last, I don't want to name names, but very big software company, very big backup software company had an exploit that, was used. Actually, two of them in the last 2 weeks. We've had two big companies where there was an exploit that was specific to their particular backup software package, and it was used to do this, right? So, and they directly target the backups, again, for the same two reasons that they started in the first place. They either want to encrypt the backup software or delete the backups to basically take the backups out of the equation, or they actually see the backup server as an exfiltration point. And this one, again, is why I talk about it in the front half, is you really want to make sure that you're stopping that exfiltration. So if they can gain administrative access to your backup server, they can do whatever they want, right? They can delete all the backups. They can also restore backups. They can do activities that look like normal backup and recovery activities, when in reality what they're doing is they're restoring data for the purposes of stealing it, right?
Sure. Yeah. So the only threat is not the risk of data being released, though, is it? I mean, if their systems, if their data on the company's servers are encrypted, they can't function, they can't operate as usual.
Correct. Right. Yeah. So either they encrypt the data and just say, well, you lost control of this database, or as I was saying earlier, they can actually encrypt your server itself. What sometimes they don't actually encrypt. Sometimes they just basically hack your the boot block so that your server won't boot. They're very resourceful and not nice people. Right? Yeah. So they'll take your
well organized, well funded, and it's a career for many of them. It's a huge
both criminal and state sponsored activity, right? North Korea, Russia, especially. These organizations are very well funded, very big companies with HR departments. They're really well organized. They reward ingenuity within their company as just like any other company does. And so this isn't just some random software run amok. It is there are real people on the other end of these attacks. And the attack on your company could be being directly managed and even directly conducted by an actual human being that is well funded and well, and available 24/7, right?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to backing up, then certainly a really common technique at the moment is using an air-gapped backup.
Right.
But if you could explain what that is for the audience, that'd be great. And then we can talk about the merits, pros and cons of that.
So the term comes from back in the day, right? So I've been doing backups for a while. Back in the day, we cut a tape, right? Tape was everything, right? It was maybe 20 years or so ago that we started to migrate over to disk. So back in the day, you cut a tape, you put a tape in a box, and you gave it to a man in a van, right? Who drove around and picked up everybody's tapes and then stored them securely. You had a gap of air between A and B, right? Which meant that the worst thing could happen in your data center, which back then we were concerned primarily about disasters and terrorist actions, right? But in this case, we would add, even if you were hacked, your entire data center was hacked, it wouldn't hack that tape in a box in a vault, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we still, what we now, that's not really possible in most environments today because they're not using tape or any kind of removable medium. And so what we talk about today is, some call it a virtual air gap or an operational air gap. And that is to make sure that at least one of the backups, at least one of the copies of your backups, or possibly the entire backup system is air gapped, meaning that it's in a completely separate administrative domain, password management domain, computing environment, storage environment. Make it as separate as possible. And so that, again, the worst could happen in your computing environment and you, it wouldn't be able to infect the backup system.
Okay, so and that could be cloud-based, or could be a physical on-site, this sort of a backup that is not connected to the network. So it's backed up and then disconnected.
That's really difficult to do. There are some who talk a little bit about that, but the challenge with that is, generally speaking, go back to humans. The more you have humans involved, the less reliable a system is going to be, right?
Sure thing.
And so what most people are doing is they do one of two things. They either have an on-prem backup system that then at the end of every backup then sends a copy of that backup up to some kind of cloud storage. And they may even use the immutable option. So, for example, most object storage providers offer the idea of turning on immutability on a particular backup, which is just a fancy word for means it can't be changed. And if you turn it on, depending on how you turn it on, you can even turn it on in such a way that says that you can't delete it, right? Object storage is already pre-set up, like sort of base functionality. You can't encrypt an object, right? You can't even change an object. You can only make a new object and delete the old object, right? It's not like a file system. So it inherently already has sort of immutability built into it. But what these features do is they then say, well, I'm going to turn on immutability for backups in this bucket. That's what we talk about in S3, the storage protocol. Anything that goes into this bucket has the immutability flag turned on, and basically means even I can't delete them, even if I change my mind. And that's one thing that some people are doing. There are still people, by the way, that are cutting tapes and handing them to a man in a van. There's nothing wrong with that either, right? Yep. I mean, the only challenge with that will be, I think you're missing out on a lot of modern recovery possibilities by doing that. Other than that, there's nothing wrong with that.
For example,
certainly not from a ransomware perspective. But anyway, so I was saying that either they do that, they copy it up into the cloud, or they use a service provider in the cloud that does their backups for them. I want to differentiate between that and just putting your backup server in the cloud. So if you have, pick your favorite backup product, and then you have an Amazon, VPC, virtual private cloud, and you put your favorite backup software in the cloud, and then you back up from your, wherever it is to the cloud. That's not what I'm talking about here, because that VPC is made to be seen as if it's essentially in your data center. So that's not really changing the security posture, right? What I'm talking about is you're using a cloud provider like Druva, which is where I work, right? We're not the only one, but we're certainly the leading SaaS provider in data protection. Basically, you're in their authentication domain. It's servers that are managed by them. Yes, in our case, they happen to be in AWS, but it's not your AWS account, it's our AWS account. And it's designed to run in AWS so that, for example, we do use S3 to store your backups. S3, when we provision a new customer, which is all done automatically, the S3 buckets that are being configured for you are automatically configured so that only our processes can write to them, right? So even if someone were to somehow get a hold of credentials, they wouldn't be able to read and write from them. There aren't backup servers that are running. The way our processes work is that there's no backup server that's running continually for someone to try to hack. And the only input into our environment is the customer's usernames and passwords, right? Which of course we support both internal MFA and Okta, the third-party MFA. To make sure that we do that as well. Yep. So that's a way to air gap your backups so that basically you can take your on-prem environment, do a bunch of work to have one of your copies be air gapped, or you can use a service like Druva to ensure that all your backups are air gapped.
Sure, thank you. And you mentioned, so for those who are still cutting tape and person in a van, so ticking the box from an air gap perspective, you said they might be missing some more modern opportunities in terms of recovery process. And I'm keen to hear what some of those would be. Yeah,
so a modern disaster recovery, and by the way, disaster recovery would be a subset of a ransomware recovery, right? There's so much that has to go on before you kick off the actual restore part of a ransomware recovery, right? I talk about typically a disaster recovery happens after a disaster, after a fire, after a flood, and the fire and the flood is gone. It's really easy to figure out what was damaged. You just those black things over there, those are, those need to be restored. And these over here that are fine, well, they don't need to be restored. In a cyber attack, you don't know any of that, and it's still ongoing, right? So all of that stuff has to be done. But the point at which you can to do a disaster recovery, if you have a modern backup and recovery system like Druva, you can use the cloud. You can basically decide in advance what you want to restore in the event of a disaster. You configure the types of VMs that, this is mainly for a virtualized type environment. So you say, this VM, in every cloud provider, there are different sort of types of VMs that have different power, different computing and RAM and all that. You make all those decisions up front. We could do a default setup for you, and then you can tweak it as necessary. And you decide like the recovery order, right? And then you can do test recoveries. But essentially, when you go to do a restore, you literally just push a button in a web UI, and then poof, your entire environment that you pre-configured is automatically configured, automatically restored in our case, in a matter of about 15 to 20 minutes. Right? Yeah, right. Regardless of the size of your environment. That's just not possible if you're using tape, right? If you're using tape, you've got to use some sort of physical world, right? You've got to use there are service providers that will provide you a data center, and you're going to, first thing you got to do is marshal the forces and get them over to the data center and get the tapes over the data center. By the time you're ready to start your recovery, our customers have already been operational for several hours, right? So if that's okay for you, right? If that meets your, in the DR world, in the backup world, we use the terms recovery time objective, recovery point objective, how long a restore is supposed to take, how much data you're allowed to lose. If that meets your requirements, then fine, right? It's just that it probably won't, right? So
it's about making informed decisions, isn't it? And I know that we're working closely with a number of our members to help them develop their disaster recovery plans.
Right.
And that's what we talk about. We talk about, well, one of the advantages of doing so proactively is that you're then able to make informed decisions. And the same is true here. Now, interestingly, we still have some clients who prefer to keep their data on site and back it up with their own servers.
Right.
And that the most common reason for that is just an ROI discussion, the return on investment discussion. So the cost of doing that compared with the cost of using cloud-based solutions. I'm interested to hear, if a client was presenting that to you, what would be the discussion you'd have with them?
Happens all the time. So what I would do is I would point out to them the normal inefficiencies of a typical on-prem backup and recovery system. And the biggest thing is that you have to design what infrastructure you need for the next 2 to 3 years, right? You have to sort of guess what because honestly, just configuring the on-prem backup infrastructure is a pain, right? It's a pain in so many regards. There's everything from the process of trying to figure out how to pay for it, paying for it, the POs and the capital purchase requests and all of that stuff. And then also figuring out how big does this thing need to be, right? And if it's going to use dedupe, which it's probably going to use dedupe, which is short for deduplication, that's going to be at best a guess, right? You're going to guess how big the infrastructure needs to be based on how well it will dedupe, which you don't know yet. You won't know. Every dedupe algorithm is different, which means you don't know how well this new system that you're buying will dedupe your data until you actually buy one and put it in the data center. But meanwhile, you have to guess how big it should be, buy one, and then 90% of it is going to go unused for most of the time, right? Meanwhile, you're powering it. You're going to pay for what you provision. You're going to buy a 500 terabyte backup server with 57 cores with 20 gigabytes of memory, whatever it is. I'm just trying to put numbers up there.
Sure.
And you're buying today for what you need in 2 to 3 years. And you're going to pay for all that storage, power for all that storage, all that time. Meanwhile, if you used a cloud provider, and also, by the way, there's all the costs of securing that infrastructure, all the stuff we spent earlier talking about earlier. In contrast, our customers, we still have to make a guess. Because again, everything I said about dedupe is true of our company as well. We're talking about data center here. If it's laptops or cloud stuff, we just charge by the user. But if we're talking about data center, it's about terabytes. And you don't have to get it right. Like if you get it wrong in a data center, your backup system is underpowered and it won't work. With us, if you guessed, you're not guessing the design of the system. All you're guessing is how big the bill is going to be, because we're going to globally deduplicate all your data and then store that data and then charge you for how much restored. And so if you get it, there's two ways, and it's going to go one way or the other. You will either guess high or guess low. Guessing high is actually, it happens. And if you guess high, it means that you paid for some credits, because basically what we do is we charge you in advance for like a year, and then we debit against, that account, right? For what you've actually used, right?
Yeah.
If you guessed high, you've got some credits left over and you roll them into your next term. If you guess low, you just renew early, right? If you guess high or low, if you guess high which is the most common scenario in a data center, if you guess high in your data center, what you've done is you've wasted potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you guess low, you've got a really underpowered system. And I've seen it where people, they really misjudged how the dedupe works, and it was underpowered on day one, and they had to go and re-architect the system. That just doesn't happen for us. The other thing, from a cost perspective, I already talked about. The other thing is what happens in a restore. So in a restore, most people configure their backup systems for what they need for backup. They don't also add in extra power for restores. So when you go to do a restore, you get the power of whatever that box or boxes happen to be. Mm-hmm. Boom, that's it. Right. And it may also be doing other things, right? You might have this really important big restore that needs to happen, but meanwhile, you also have backups that have to happen, right? So you get however fast that box is, that's what you get. With us, you get the entire power of the cloud, right? So we can basically, our CTO likes to use the phrase darken the sky, right? As long as the only thing we have to make sure is that the amount of bandwidth between you and us is sufficient to do the job. And what happens in a large restore, we will simply just fill that pipe as much as you allow us. And I will tell you that we get into bake-offs with on-prem backup people all the time, and we often beat them, and meaning restore speed. Yeah. And people are amazed. They're like, how is that possible? It's like, well, because they're running on a x86 box, and we're running with the entire power of the cloud, and that's why.
Yeah, sure. Speaking of recoveries, and that's it's often not the main focus, certainly in the media, when they talk about there's been a cyber attack, it's a ransomware attack, right, and they've asked for this much money. That tends to be what gets talked about, and certainly as we're talking about here, the restoring the systems and getting the businesses up and running again probably isn't sexy enough for the media, but it really matters for the business owner and for their clients. And I'm interested in your experience, the difference, the impact of an attack, a successful attack, that then leads to a restoration. the difference between those companies who have disaster recovery plans, who have an incident response plan in place, they've thought about it, they've planned for it, and can pull it out of the drawer, figuratively speaking, if they become subject to such an attack, compared with those companies who do not. Can you speak to your observations over the years of the differences?
So Druva is doing a couple of ransomware recoveries a week now, right?
Yeah, right.
So not the company, but on behalf of our customers, right?
Sure. Yeah.
That'd be a rough company to work at, but and what we are generally finding again is that. So even again earlier, I was saying that there's a difference between having a disaster recovery and having a ransomware recovery. So we have, we try to work with our customers to help them understand they need a ransomware recovery playbook. Those that have the playbook, they're usually back up and running very quickly. Depending on the type of the attack, it may be, it's most likely going to be days, just because of the amount of research that has to go in to figure out how big the attack has been, how well it has permeated the environment. That also tends to dictate how big the recovery is. Also, whether or not they use our cloud, we have the ability to restore in the cloud, or if they're wanting to just restore back in place. By the way, one of the beauties of restoring in the cloud is you're guaranteed a pristine infrastructure. Right. That's one of the problems is you can't, if you're restoring in place, you don't necessarily know if you're restoring to a pristine infrastructure. But yeah, we've had many successful restores and no abject failures of which I'm aware. What it really comes down to in success has been those who have, how well they planned for the cyber aspects of this, right? Yep. We make the restore part relatively easy, but if they, and we have a team that works with those who are in the midst of a ransomware attack. It's part of the service that we offer, and it's pretty evident once you start working with someone that they either prepared or didn't prepare for this, right? So we can see that that's just it, right?
And the implication of that, it takes longer, it's more stressful.
Exactly. The thing is, the question, are you enacting a playbook or are you trying to figure out what you're going to do, right? If you're doing the former, you're just going through the steps that you've already previously determined. If you're to give you a really bad example of how bad it can go the other way, would be the very large ransomware attack against Rackspace in the U.S. This was back in December, and Rackspace. It was a direct attack on their exchange infrastructure, and I don't know what's the more depressing part of the story: the fact that the attack used a vulnerability that was patched weeks earlier. That if they had just patched their exchange servers in a more proactive manner, the attack would have never happened, or the fact that based on what you can observe, it was very clear that they did not have, they were not following a playbook, right? Yeah, right. They're sitting around a table and they're like, okay, what are we going to do? And they chose to move everybody over to Microsoft 365. They were using hosted Exchange. They chose to move everybody over to Microsoft 365. And they, as a result, this was before they had restored everything, right? And because they did that, now they're on 365 and they're sending and receive email. That's great. But what about my old email, right? A lot of people have some really valuable stuff in their old email. Well, they had to restore that entire environment and then figure out how to get the data from A to B, right? And it was 2 weeks before they had a fully tested plan, right? Because they were notifying people as it was going on. They were saying, "Hey, we've tested this. We know where we're going to work, and now we're going to start restoring customer data so that you can download your data and get your emails back." It took them 2 weeks to develop a plan because they didn't have one in advance, right?
Yeah, sure. And I'm assuming having a plan also helps to influence the backup design, the philosophy behind it.
Yes. It's going to. I think it's definitely the disaster recovery part of the plan, right? I think the one good thing that's come out of all of this mess, right? The ransomware and the probability that, which is starting to approach, 1-to-1, the probability that you will suffer a ransomware attack is pretty much at this point close to 1-to-1. Is that everyone's talking about their DR plans, right? Back in the day when I was directly consulting with customers on how to, it's like, you really need to have a good DR plan. And I was getting responses like, well, if, like we used to use 9/11, right? The terrorist attacks on 9/11 as a way to justify, look, something like 9/11 could happen. And they'd say one of two things. Well, I'm not in Manhattan, and the chances of me getting hit by attack like that are pretty low. And by the way, if I was in those towers, I would be dead and I wouldn't have to worry about it. And I'm not making light here. This is literally what customers would tell me.
Yeah, right.
So, so when you say, does it impact the backup design and the DR design? Absolutely. And the good news is that we're having these conversations now, and that people are, I think, taking their DR more seriously, because that whole thing of, well, I probably won't be hit by planes. Well, you will be hit by ransomware. It's no longer a if, but a when. And so,
yeah, absolutely. And even
right?
even COVID was useful in terms of thinking about business continuity plans and so on. That's been a very useful catalyst. I mean, it was a pain in the backside in many, many ways. But
unfortunately, COVID also,
that was one of them.
Yeah, unfortunately, COVID also made ransomware worse, because everybody was working from home in their nice, GUI, not hardened infrastructure. Oh no, I was thinking about their infrastructure, right? So a lot of people got ransomware when they were working at Starbucks. Didn't mean to malign, that brand, but it doesn't matter wherever you happen to be.
Yeah, sure.
And then they bring it into the, you connect via VPN to your data center, and now you're essentially on the LAN, and then, boom, right? So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Curtis, I think we're coming up on time. I appreciate very much that we've gone through and really covered from A to Z. See, bilingual. See what I did there? A to Z.
I totally expected the Z there. I would have understood. I'm bilingual.
But is there anything else before we sign off, is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with? Just any final words of wisdom?
Well, in addition to getting a backup and DR system that is fully air-gapped and DR friendly, right? Not just a box of tapes or even in this case, a box of disk. I would ask you to research this idea of helping to prevent ransomware from doing everything I mentioned in the first half of the call, right? Look to prevent lateral movement within your organization, to shut down things like RDP and SMB when they are not required. My true dream would be that you put in some kind of. And by the way, you can also do things like there's an entire industry called darn it, it's DDI. I think it's DNS. The acronym is leaving me, but there's an entire industry that helps you manage your DNS and IP infrastructure. And what they can do is they can actually use machine learning and AI to recognize that there's a command and control request going on and just sort of sinkhole it or block it. So stop that. And then also the real dream would be to have something that is watching your typical network traffic, and then again using machine learning or AI to say, hey, why is this server that has never spoken publicly before suddenly uploading data to Russia? Right?
Yep.
I think that's the beauty of AI and ML is being able to look for patterns and then stop them when they start being abnormal.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And look, I appreciate your time very much and for sharing your wisdom that you've gleaned over many years of being in the world of backup and helping clients through their disaster recovery plans. And we'll stay on for a little bit longer, but I'm going to say thank you again and hit the stop record button, and then we can keep going. But I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Curtis.
Anytime.